Who was really the author of Frankenstein? How did Jane Austen write her novels, and should Franz Kafka's manuscripts have been burned? This is a video about literary manuscripts, those marks of creation and genius, and I even have a related giveaway for you here. But first we're going to look at a manuscript that a famous author wished had been thrown in the sea. In 1823, Charles Lamb was visiting Trinity College, Cambridge, and was shown one of the great treasures of the library. It was a slim folio volume of about 50 pages, and on the cover in gilt letters it said, Poemata Milton Manuscripta. It is a book that would make any bibliophile hugely excited, containing poem after poem by John Milton, author of Paradise Lost, all of them original manuscripts written in his own hand. But when Lamb opened it up, he was horrified. When he usually read Milton's poetry, it was finely printed, nicely spaced, and in its final finished form. It looked as if it had always been thus, the immaculate conception of an imaginative genius. But that was not what he saw here. Instead, as he turned those pages, it was messy, written in a scratchy hand on worn and brown paper. It didn't feel like meeting a perfect genius. It felt like meeting a madman. And he didn't just wish that he had never been shown these pages, he wished they didn't exist at all. And this is what he said about it. I had thought of the Lycidas as full-grown beauty, as springing up with all its parts absolute, till, in an evil hour, I was shown the original copy of it, kept like some treasure to be proud of. I wish they had thrown them in the Cam, or sent them after the latter cantos of Spenser, into the Irish Channel. It's a visceral reaction to the ugly and messy truth of literary creation. Verses that Lamb had once thought were immortal were instead interlined, corrected as if their words were mortal, alterable, displaceable at pleasure, as if they might have been otherwise. His resolution on the manuscript was final. I will never go into the workshop of any great artist again. Now, I don't know about you, but I have the complete opposite reaction to Charles Lamb when it comes to literary manuscripts. I want to spend as much time as is humanly possible in the workshops of great artists. I want to feel like I'm peering over their shoulder as they do their work. And that's exactly what this video is about, because last month I went to the Bodleian Library to meet with Professors Dirk van Huller and Mark Nixon, who have co-curated an exhibition of literary manuscripts called Right Cut Rewrite. It's filled with the kind of manuscripts that would throw Charles Lamb into a rage and throw me into a frenzy of a very different kind. And in this video we're going to look at up close, and Dirk and Mark are going to take us through 3 of these incredible manuscripts. One of the very few surviving manuscripts of Jane Austen, the original first draft of Frankenstein, and a manuscript that was ordered to be destroyed by its author, Franz Kafka's Das Schloss, or The Castle. Through these we can get an inside track looking exactly at how Jane Austen wrote, put to bed once and for all the question of who really wrote Frankenstein, and catch Franz Kafka in a moment of indecision, and see how in that indecision he created one of the most famous narrators in all literature. None of Jane Austen's manuscripts survive for any of her finished novels, meaning we don't have manuscripts for Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, Persuasion, or Northanger Abbey. So when we are trying to understand how Jane Austen wrote fiction, we have to turn to her discard pile.
In Jane Austen's time, people didn't have the habit of keeping manuscripts. It's only when, for instance, the chapter was not published and had to be rewritten, then we do have manuscripts. Of Persuasion, there are a few chapters that we have in the British Library. And we also have manuscripts of the books that were abandoned.
And it's one of those rare discarded manuscripts we looked closely at the Bodleian.
The Watsons is a manuscript that was abandoned. If you just look at the manuscript, you see that Austen's modus operandi was to fill the page. There is almost no margin. It's almost blackened. And then whenever she crosses something out, it can happen that a whole passage becomes so black that she had to rewrite it. And when she rewrote a passage, she did it on a separate page, and that patch of paper was then pinned to the other manuscript, covering the blackened passage.
And so in the exhibition, when you visit, you can do one of my favourite things in the world, peer over the shoulder of a great artist and watch them as they work. We can see here laid flat a double-page spread from the manuscript of the Watsons and that incredibly densely written hand that Dirk was talking about. On the right-hand side, you can see that the top half of the page has been entirely crossed through by Jane Austen, and what she has then done, shown here above the double-page spread, is taken a separate piece of paper and written out her new passage, before pinning it over the unwanted version. It's amazing that we both have discarded first draft and replaced second draft surviving, but I couldn't help asking Dirk about the pins.
We actually still, at the Bodleian, we still have the pins, and they are being kept very carefully.
And when we zoom in on this still shot here, we can even see those pinholes that Jane Austen made, so tactilely making her correction over 2 centuries ago. Before we move on to the next incredible manuscript, we have the giveaway I promised, because I know that some of you won't be able to make it over to Oxford for the exhibition, so I'm giving away the next best thing. I have this goodie bag here from the Bodleian Library, and we have the tote bag, the exhibition poster, and the exhibition catalogue that Dirk and Mark co-authored. If you want a chance of winning it, then I'll send this anywhere in the world. Just make sure you're subscribing to my channel and leave a comment below which is your favourite manuscript we talked about in this video, and I'll pick my favourite comment as the winner. The story of how the next manuscript came into being is a famous one, but it's also controversial. 1816 is known as the year without a summer, and that year, Lord Byron, Mary and Percy Shelley and John Polidori were staying on Lake Geneva. They were taking refuge from the storms in the Villa Diodati, and that stormy June they spent the nights exchanging ghost stories with each other, and it was this exchange of stories that inspired Mary Shelley to write Frankenstein. She was still a teenager, but at the Bodleian we can look at her first draft of the novel.
It's quite remarkable that Mary Shelley started writing Frankenstein when she was 18 years old. The manuscript itself shows obviously that it is her work, but that she received every now and again a few hints and helps from Percy Bysshe Shelley.
And as we study the manuscript, we can see traces of Percy Shelley's suggestions as annotations.
Most of them are in the margins or as additions between the lines. There is actually a very interesting online edition, the Shelley Godwin archive. You can just choose to highlight Mary's handwriting, and if you click on another button, you get Percy's handwriting.
Because Mary Shelley was so young, a woman, married to a famous author, and because when Frankenstein was originally published in 1818, it was done so anonymously, many people have speculated over the years whether the novel's true author was Percy Shelley and not Mary. But as we go through this original draft of the manuscript, we can see and distinguish their two hands at work. As we do, we can see collaboration, but Percy's role is clearly minor. He is an editor, not an author, making small suggestions tucked in between the lines or in the margins. In fact, there is only one passage in the entire novel that can be said to have originated from his own hand, and we can even see how that was done, because next to the first draft of Frankenstein is Percy's notebook from their time in Switzerland.
This is the so-called Geneva Notebook. This is a notebook that Shelley compiled his thoughts and impressions of the time that they spent around the Lake Geneva. In the exhibition, we show a passage of a description of the town of Evian, which has been used by Mary Shelley, but was written by Percy Shelley.
Standing over that cabinet is an extraordinary feeling. It feels like we're in that room with the Shelleys, as Mary was getting to work on one of the most groundbreaking novels in English literature. That torn out page of Percy Shelley's is a chance survival, but we can move from that to a defiant survival in the next manuscript. Because over the other side of the Frankenstein cabinet is a manuscript its author didn't want us to see. Before Franz Kafka died, he instructed his friend and literary executor Max Brod to destroy all his unpublished papers and ensure that none of them would see the light of day. But as Mark explains, Brod chose a different path.
But his literary executor and friend Max Brod decided that this would be a terrible thing to do. After Kafka's death, he refused to destroy his manuscripts, and as it were, became Kafka's advocate and made him, in many ways, the famous author that he is today.
If Max Brod had granted Kafka's wish, we would be deprived of most of his work. And it wouldn't have just meant that great novels like Das Schloss, The Castle, would never have been published. It would also mean that we would have lost their original documents, these original manuscripts that give us such an insight into the mind of Kafka.
Brod writes, for instance, at the beginning of the manuscript that this is where the Schloss starts, because in the beginning of the manuscript there are a few pages that are in the third person narration. Then Kafka changes his mind and starts writing with a first person narrator. Ich, I.
But if you've read The Castle, you might be a bit surprised by this revelation in the manuscript. One of the most famous aspects of the novel is its narration, but that narration isn't in the first person ich or I at all, so we have to take a closer look at the manuscript to see Kafka change his mind again.
This is something that Dorrit Cohn in the 1960s discovered. After about 25 pages, he changes every ich into K, and he goes back to the first page and he changes every ich to K.
And as we peer into the exhibition cases, we can see this incredible moment in literary history where Kafka invents his famous narrator. Look closely at the centre of the page here, and we can see that Kafka originally wrote ich for the very last time in the entire manuscript, and he does not cross it out. Instead, he just takes up his pen and in thick black ink introduces his famous narrator, K. It's a complex moral question whether Brod should have honoured Kafka's wishes and whether we should be allowed to read and publish books Kafka never wanted read, or look at and study manuscripts he wanted to see destroyed. Kafka died in obscurity. He was not a famous writer in his own day and was nothing close to the level of fame and literary celebrity he has now. He didn't know what the survival and publication of these manuscripts would yield. He probably thought they would yield very little. But surely, for moments of discovery like this, being able to see Kafka wrestle with indecision in real time, Brod's defiance was worth it.